All right, let's make a start. Good evening, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this Edinburgh World Heritage event. I'm Christina Sinclair, the Director of Edinburgh World Heritage. This evening, we will be hearing from someone who really needs no introduction for those of you familiar with our events, Nick Hotham. He will talk about Edinburgh's hidden past of slavery and colonialism that is beginning to be better understood and discussed in terms of today's attitudes and the impact on the communities and visitors of our wonderful World Heritage Site. But first we must start with some housekeeping. You won't be able to unmute yourselves, I'm afraid, during the event or turn on your camera. This is to ensure that the camera and the audio are focused on our speaker. If you would like to ask a question, please do use the Q&A function. We know that this is a very sensitive subject, so please do remember to be polite and relevant. We will be keeping an eye on what's coming in, and we'll bring in a few of your questions and comments to our speaker towards the end. The event is also being recorded, so if you do want to catch our discussion at a later time, you will be able to do so. Please keep an eye on our social media channels for the links to this and for various other goodies. We are on Twitter at Edinburgh WH, facebook.com/Edinburgh World Heritage, and on Instagram at Edinburgh World Heritage. Now, the coronavirus outbreak continues to impact all of us. And obviously at Edinburgh World Heritage, many fundraising events have had to be cancelled, and some of our important conservation work has had to be put on pause. We are therefore asking our friends and supporters to help us get through this period of uncertainty. If you support our conservation and community work in the city, please do consider becoming one of our supporters tonight. We've made this very easy. You can donate via text. As you can see on the screen, you just text the word Edinburgh WH with the amount you want to donate to 70450. If you'd like to donate £10, for example, then text Edinburgh WH 10 to 70450. And of course, if you would like to become a member and support us in that way, then please do go to the member section of our website. Right, enough of that. Time to introduce our guest. Nick Hotham is an expert in heritage management and interpretation and holds master's degrees in history and art history from the University of Cambridge and cultural heritage management from the University of Birmingham. From 2016 to 2021, I'm very happy to say that he was head of engagement at Edinburgh World Heritage. He is now a freelance writer and heritage consultant and is in the process of moving to sunnier climates in France with his family. So Nick, wonderful to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Christina. It's great to be back. I'm missing everyone. Right, thanks for this opportunity to address this sensitive subject, very important though. And my objective is really to avoid the pitfalls of the culture wars and cancel culture, and simply first to review the ways that slavery and colonialism were interwoven into the economic, social and cultural life of Edinburgh, especially during its golden age. And secondly, in the light of this evidence, to ask what, if anything, we should do about it. The first is an exercise in straightforward historical inquiry. The second is more of a philosophical and moral question. I should say at the outset that this is a subject which requires further research. Scotland's role in the slave trade and the degree to which it benefited from colonial exploitation has only been a focus of major academic research for 10 years or so. This is now being rectified. Nevertheless, the area is less researched than in England or France. But why is this topic important to Edinburgh World Heritage and to the management of the World Heritage Site, an organisation which grew out of the grassroots conservation movement in Edinburgh during the 60s and 70s? Because we believe that in addition to appreciating the value of Edinburgh's heritage, indeed to use UNESCO's technical term, its outstanding universal value, we feel it's also important to understand that our superb built heritage had a cost, a human cost, not only, of course, to those people, men and women and children who were enslaved or exploited through colonization, but also to many others who were rarely part of the Edinburgh story, those removed from their traditional pattern of country life through the clearances and agricultural improvement, especially in the borders, or those who laboured in building the foundations for our new city as it slowly expanded to the north. Appreciating the human cost of our heritage is important because it demonstrates that we are able to be honest about the past and avoid the tendency to self-mythologize. And this is especially important to our young people, as well as to the descendants of the victims of slavery or colonialism. So, for some context, Britain, of course, was the dominant force in the slave trade between the early years of the 18th century and its abolition in 1807. Over this period, approximately 3.4 million Africans were transported to a life of servitude by British ships. The system of bondage was chattel slavery, in which the enslaved person and their children became the property of their masters until death, with no legal right to be treated as a human being. This condition is in no way comparable to indentured labour, a fate suffered by some unfortunate Jacobites, among others, as I'm sure you're aware. These workers suffered harsh conditions, but they were paid, and their contracts were for specific periods and enforced by law. The business of slavery got underway under the reign of Charles II, depicted here in the famous equestrian statue which sits in Parliament Square. Charles established the Royal Africa Company in 1660, which transported more Africans into slavery than any other British company. Between the 1670s and the 1750s, around 150,000 men, women, and children passed through the company's African coastal fortresses on their way to lifelong enslavement. As a royal chartered monopoly, the Royal Africa Company was able to call upon the Royal Navy to protect its business, defend its fortresses, and intercept foreign interlopers who attempted to muscle in on the trade. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain dominated the global trade in enslaved peoples. The royal in the company's title was not honorific. James, Duke of York, the future King James VII, was actively involved in its administration and drew profits and dividends, which partly funded his very comfortable exile in Saint-Germain-en-Laye following the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So what of Scotland's involvement in the slave trade, and more broadly in the slave economy, a phrase which takes in the entire ecosystem from the capture of a slave to the delivery of finished goods of tobacco, sugar, etc. to its final consumer? As mentioned earlier, this is a fairly recent subject for academic study and has not been a focus for Scottish university history departments. But a key publication appeared in 2015, a collection of essays edited by Tom Devine entitled Recovering Scotland's Slavery Past, which I'd recommend. The evidence suggests that Scots benefited disproportionately from this slave economy. For example, a total of 4,000 to 5,000 Scottish settlers have been identified in the West Indies for the period 1660 to 1700, before the Act of Union. By the late 18th century, there were proportionately more Scots throughout the plantations in relation to their share of the British population compared to English, Irish, or Welsh. In fact, following the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63, Scots flooded into the region. Why? In short, opportunities abroad and conditions at home. Scotland had become a country in which emigration had become the norm rather than the exception, especially for the Scottish laird classes and their cadet branches. Improvements in healthcare also quite simply meant more surviving offspring among the middling and wealthier classes, all in search of a lucrative career, which for many was simply not an option at home. A point made by Sir Geoff Palmer is that the legacy of Scots in the West Indies lives on in the surnames of the descendants of the enslaved. He estimates that around 70% of the names in the Jamaica telephone directories are of Scottish origin. By the time of eventual abolition in 1833, Scottish slave ownership was relatively higher than English ownership. As we'll see from the compensation records, a significant number of these owners, as well as their descendants, had made Edinburgh their home and invested the profits from slavery in properties and businesses. If we look at trade, the slave-produced goods of sugar, tobacco, rice, rum, and cotton were central to Scottish overseas commerce for most of the 18th century and the dominant products in the country's international trade to a far greater extent than the equivalent sectors in England. In 1761, to take 1 year at random, 47 million pounds of tobacco leaf were landed in Scotland, 1/3 of the nation's imports. Once processed for use, this tobacco then went on to constitute 2/3 of Scotland's exports for that year. In summary, the slave-based Atlantic economy was a clear driver of Scotland's economic transformation between the middle of the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. It underpinned economically our golden age. Before we look in detail at Edinburgh's role in the slave economy, there is another question we need to consider, which is explored in depth in Tom Devine's article Lost to History, as well as by Dr. Stephen Mullen of the University of Glasgow. The question is why Scotland's engagement in the slave system was ignored or lost from both academic history and the popular imagination until fairly recently. In modern times, a myth of denial has evolved. It's almost been casually accepted that it was "ni us," to quote the title of Stephen Mullen's book. An element of deliberate distancing may have existed at the time. Michael Morris points out that in Scott's Rob Roy, Nicol Jarvie, the portentous voice of the Glasgow merchant class, proudly presents a brandy punch with limes, but is unable to even bring himself to pronounce the name of the West Indies from where the limes came, instead twice using the euphemism, "yonder a war." The assessment of compensation claims for Scottish slave owners was not complete until 1837. But 4 decades later, in 1883, on the 50th anniversary of abolition, the Glasgow West India Association felt able to publish the following statement in the Herald. "It is to Glasgow's lasting honour that while Bristol and Liverpool were up to their elbows in the slave trade, Glasgow kept out of it. The reproach can never be levelled at our city, as it was at Liverpool, that there was not a stone in her streets that was not cemented with the blood of a slave." This is about as hypocritical as you can get, and of course refers to slave trading alone and in isolation. More recently, during the 70s and 80s, public remembrance of slavery in England has been transformed. Higher public awareness of black culture due to events such as Notting Hill Carnival, as well as the Brixton race riots, were key factors. Black History Month grew out of these events and gathered momentum due to lottery funding from the mid-90s. London, Liverpool and Bristol all saw the opening of galleries and museums dedicated to slavery and black history in full consultation with local communities. In 2007, the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, Tony Blair commented, "The slave trade was a profound, inhuman experience, and the bicentenary provides us with an opportunity to express our sorrow that it happened." Not so in Scotland. Jackie Kay commented, "Scotland is a canny nation when it comes to remembering and forgetting. The plantation owner is never wearing a kilt." The original exhibits at the Museum of Scotland, which opened in 1998, made no reference to the nation's slavery-connected past. And this amnesia continues, unfortunately. In a very recent article in the Herald I noticed last week, Neil McLennan, one of Scotland's most distinguished educators, comments, "If you read guidance from the SQA, which is the Scottish Qualifications Authority, the body which oversees exams, the school curriculum gives examples of slave ports like Liverpool and Bristol, but the slave trade wasn't solely centred on England. McLennan has asked for Glasgow to be inserted given its prominent role in generating huge profits from the trade in slave goods. This hasn't happened." So let's now turn to Edinburgh in a little more detail. Our focus is thematic and selective, not to attempt an exhaustive list of every object or street name associated with slavery and colonialism in the city. The approach is designed to present a representative overview of the degree to which Edinburgh, slavery and colonialism were interwoven. We should start then by considering the city's physical expansion between the years 1767, the year of the adoption of James Craig's plan for the new town, and about 1850. Following approval of the plan for the first new town, Edinburgh underwent an unprecedented physical expansion. Where did the capital come from? While research does not give us a complete answer, we know from the records of those who received compensation after the end of slavery that many early residents of the new town owned enslaved people and plantations. We also know that profits from colonialism, specifically from the activities of the East India Company, were also invested in the city's expansion. One of the critical developments that supported the reappraisal of Scotland's and Edinburgh's role in the slave economy from the 18th and 19th century Britain has been the establishment of the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery at the University College London. In 1833, Parliament finally abolished slavery in the British Caribbean, Mauritius and the Cape. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807, but it took yet another 26 years to secure the emancipation of the enslaved. In place of slavery, the negotiated settlement established a system of apprenticeship, tying the newly freed men and women into another form of unfree labour under fixed terms. It also granted £20 million in compensation to be paid by British taxpayers, not to former slaves, of course, but to former slave owners. This debt was only finally paid off by the Treasury in 2015. The records associated with compensation payments provided the starting point for the UCL project, and in the second phase, the UCL team also traced back to 1763 the ownership histories of the 4,000 or so estates identified in the first place. In doing so, they doubled the number of estates identified and added another 20,000 slave owners. All of this information is on their website. What does this tell us about Edinburgh? The data show that 112 residents of Edinburgh received compensation, compared to 35 in Glasgow and 1,007 in London. Relative to population, as measured in the census of 1800, this means that Edinburgh had a higher number of former slave owners and their beneficiaries than either London or Glasgow, by quite a significant margin. We know that 76 residents of the new town were slave owners and received compensation from the government. So let's look at some examples. 5 Charlotte Square, latterly named Bute House, is now of course the official residence of the First Minister. We know that the first 2 of Bute House's historic residents directly benefited from the Atlantic slave trade, either owning plantations and enslaved people or benefiting from the compensation paid out following abolition. From an architectural point of view, the north side of Charlotte Square, designed by Robert Adam in 1791 but not completed until after his death, is the culmination of what we call the first new town. The house in the centre of the north side, number 6, is probably the grandest in the square, and it was to here that James Innes Crawford, its first resident, moved in the late 1790s. Crawford had a country residence too, Cleghorn House near Lanark. He was a member of the Highland Society, a captain in the 10th Regiment of the North British Militia, and had scientific and literary interests. His mother lived with him until his marriage in 1799, and shortly after he moved to nearby George Street. Crawford's wealth was derived from Belfield, a sugar plantation in St. James, Jamaica, which he inherited at the age of 5 or 6 on the death of his father, James Crawford. James Jr. was born in Jamaica in 1776, but within 2 years of his father's death, his mother had returned to Scotland, where she remarried. He does not appear to have visited his plantation as an adult or met the several hundred enslaved people, also his personal property, who lived and worked there. But his fortunes were bound up with their subjugation, and he was liable also for the debts of his planter father, reportedly over £15,000 in the mid-1790s, when the net proceeds of the estate were £3,000 a year. That's £460,000 today, and in terms of purchasing power, close to 5 million. Subsequent residents of Bute House were also connected with the slave economy. Sir John Sinclair bought the property in 1806, moving 3 doors from his previous address at number 9. A more illustrious character than Crawford, he held a seat in the House of Commons from 1780 to 1811, but is best remembered today as the compiler of the Statistical Account of Scotland, a landmark survey of the country's geography, economy and inhabitants. Sinclair was a trustee of the marriage settlement of the Honourable Archibald MacDonald and Jane Campbell, who married in 1802. The settlement included 3 plantations in St. Vincent. Sinclair died in 1835 before the slave compensation was paid out, but the remaining trustee received a half share of the 15,000 or so pounds for the ownership of 610 enslaved people. So just 1 house and 2 stories of 2 early residents, but to some extent typical of the many which can be uncovered across the elegant streets of our beloved new town. Dundas House, built by Sir Lawrence Dundas, 1st Baronet, who owned 2 estates worked by enslaved people in the West Indies, in Dominica and Grenada. 8 Queen Street, owned by John Blackburn, who made his fortune in Jamaica, returned to Edinburgh by 1810, subsequently became a Glasgow merchant. He left £107,000. 78 Great King Street, owned by Thomas Duncan, who compensated for 447 enslaved people across 3 estates in Grenada. And so on and so on. One last footnote to the story of Edinburgh and the compensation list is the question of where the cash was invested. The answer in many cases was the railway industry, which was undergoing a major boom from the 1830s onwards. Research by Nicholas Draper has shown that slave owners were often the most active investors and directors of railway companies, and in some, this was a significant percent of the total. This seems to be the case with the Glasgow to Edinburgh line, and of course with our own station here at Haymarket. So what should we do with this information? Across Germany and other countries occupied by the Nazis, you'll find small memorials to the victims of Nazi oppression, known as Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones. There are now more than 70,000 such memorial plaques, or sets, laid in more than 1,200 cities and towns across Europe and Russia. The inscription on each stone begins, "Here lived," followed by the victim's name, date of birth, and fate, internment, suicide, exile, or in the vast majority of cases, deportation and murder. Together, the Stolpersteine constitute the largest monument in the world. Nazi genocide cannot be compared to chattel slavery, but we can remember slavery in the same way the Jews and Germans remember the Holocaust. We believe in saying never forget when it comes to the Holocaust, but more generally to those who died in 2 world wars, and we should consider the victims of slavery in the same way. The ship was a concentration camp, an enclosure of closely packed human bodies. But there's a difference. The point of the slave trade was not to kill people, though there were millions of deaths in what we would call collateral damage. The point of the slave trade was to maximize profit by getting as many living bodies as possible to the New World. But I think the idea of a stumbling stone in some form is a compelling one, something that causes us not to fall, but rather to stop in our tracks and reflect and never forget. Edinburgh World Heritage is working with the Art Festival and a leading sculptor to explore what this might be. Our second theme concerns international trade and the profits from slavery and colonialism. Edinburgh-based banks were involved in financing all aspects of the Atlantic economy of slavery. Additionally, the production of locally manufactured products, such as linen, were used to clothe enslaved people. These 2 financial opportunities came together in the case of the British Linen Bank. The entity was founded as a linen manufacturing company in Edinburgh in 1746, but then evolved into banking and is a predecessor of Lloyd's. By the 1750s, it was, according to Tom Devine, probably not just the largest single firm in the Scottish linen industry, but in the Scottish economy as a whole. One of the most lucrative linen products during this period, crucial to the domestic economy, was the trade of slave cloth. Linen production had long provided economic prosperity to Scotland. During the 18th century, linen manufacturing was the largest industry in terms of employees, with 90% of all Scottish linen exported to North America or the West Indies. While Scotland was also involved in the manufacture of higher quality fine lawn cambric linens, its primary production focused on the cheap, coarser fabric, known as slave cloth, which was exported in vast amounts across the Atlantic to clothe the enslaved workers on the Scottish-owned plantations. The British Linen Bank, whose roots lay in the Scottish linen industry, stood on St Andrew Square. Our third theme looks at politics and patronage in 18th century Scotland, which of course brings us inevitably to the question of Henry Dundas and to his very large monument, and of course to his role in delaying the abolition of slave trade between 1791, when William Wilberforce first proposed the end of the importation of enslaved people from Africa, and 1807, when the trade was finally abolished. As is well known, rather than advocate for immediate abolition, Dundas stated that my object is gradually and experimentally to prove the practicability of the abolition of the trade. This delay in the abolition of the trade would provide sufficient time, Dundas argued, for the slave populations of the West Indies to be sustained through breeding. Part of Dundas's master plan, therefore, was to ensure the transportation of male and female people under the age of 20. So was Dundas an abolitionist or an anti-abolitionist? Eminent historians such as Roger Ansey, David Bryan Davies, and others, including senior historians at both Edinburgh and Glasgow universities, as well as Toronto, who also have a Dundas Street, by the way, have argued that he was most certainly not an abolitionist, and the thanks he received from the West Indian lobby during the 1790s would seem to support this conclusion. On the other hand, biographer Roger Fry has described how Dundas arrived at pragmatic compromise, how he was widely praised for his work behind the scenes to offer something to everyone. And of course, the slave trade was eventually abolished. The role of Edinburgh World Heritage as connectors of people to their heritage involves providing information on the monument. It's not to undertake our own historical research on the Dundas question, but to assess and communicate the balance of opinion among academics who are actively engaged in researching the topic. To quote Diana Patton, William Robertson Professor of History at the University of Edinburgh, "No historian of slavery and abolition considers Dundas to be an abolitionist." Stephen Mullen of the University of Glasgow has added, "Dundas may have supported abolition in theory, but in practice he used his considerable influence to oppose abolition." Our conclusion is therefore that Dundas was an anti-abolitionist. It should also be noted that in 1796, the agreed compromise date for abolition, which of course was further postponed, Dundas, now in the role of Secretary of State for War in the Colonies, and Prime Minister William Pitt, were engaged in a huge military mission to secure Jamaica and the ceded islands from the French, and attempt to reinstate chattel slavery in Haiti after the formerly enslaved there had struggled to successfully emancipate themselves. Dundas continued to oppose abolition in his later position in the House of Lords until his impeachment for embezzlement of funds in 1806, for which he was acquitted. The slave trade eventually ended in 1807 with a change of government. Should the monument be removed or adapted in some other way, as suggested here by Tom Fairley, a recent graduate of the Mackintosh School of Architecture? Probably not, though I do think the actual sculpture has limited artistic value and the column oversized for James Craig's otherwise elegant square. Fortunately, the Melville Monument is really the only truly controversial one in the city. Our statues are typically of worthy clergymen, poets, soldiers, and philosophers, though our most famous philosopher has got himself into trouble recently, 245 years after his death, but I will not tackle this comment unless pushed. And of course, the other point worth mentioning is that in the World Heritage Site, we have 48 statues of men, 3 of animals, and no women, with the exception of Queen Victoria. The fourth theme I do need to tackle is the connection between our famous Edinburgh institutions to slavery and colonialism. These are many, far too many for one person to research, and the positive news is that these connections are fully recognised by some of our institutions, starting with our schools. George Watson's was funded to a very significant extent directly from the trade in enslaved people. Watson gave the sum of £144,000 Scots for the foundation of George Watson's Hospital in 1723. That equated to £12,000 sterling, the equivalent of nearly £2 million today. As is typical in Edinburgh, few people have raised the issue of Watson's wealth until now. The 1970 history of the school characterises his business interests as widely dispersed, and lists examples ranging from textiles and funding shipping to Venice, to the collection of the city beer tax. The more recent illustrated history, published in 2006, does not focus greatly on George Watson. It drew on the research of that earlier volume and lists the same activities. We do not know what proportion of Watson's wealth came from slavery, but information on his involvement in slaving voyage in 1695-6 has been in the public domain since 1996. We now also have evidence of his involvement in more than one such ship. Contained in the Edinburgh City Archives is a series of letters between George Watson and his various business partners. Some of these are from his 2 Scottish associates in London, Michael Kincaid and James Pitcairn. These 3 men, along with some other select Scottish merchants, decided to make money through the transatlantic slave trade during a period in which Scots were barred by England from such ventures. The school has said that, quote, "We certainly cannot ignore what we now understand about the evil of slavery and the consequences of that evil which remain all too evident today. There are no simple answers to the complex questions of historical context, identity, and racial justice that are raised by our fuller understanding of the life of George Watson and his legacy to us. We are guardians of a heritage that is about far more than just one man who had died many years before our first school admitted its first pupil. But we cannot shirk our responsibility to consider how the legacy of George Watson should be understood in the world that we all live in today and which our young people will help shape tomorrow. Other schools are going through a similar process of review and consultation, including Gillespie's, opened in 1803 and funded by Edinburgh merchant James Gillespie, who amassed great wealth from the tobacco trade, a key slave product. Also to note is James Buchanan, whose memorial is at Dean Cemetery. Though more often associated with Glasgow, James Buchanan made his fortune from the profits of slavery, owned a house in Edinburgh's West End, and set up an industrial school for boys with his legacy. His bequest still supports education and apprenticeships in Scotland. We also need to look at our medical institutions, such as the Royal College of Physicians, the Medical School, and the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. There's no doubt that Edinburgh's historic medical institutions were established to alleviate human suffering and pursue excellence in medical science. The Charter of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh of 1736 rightly describes it as so good and laudable a charity. But there is a stain on Edinburgh's history of medical accomplishment. Many of the world-class doctors who trained in Edinburgh used their skills to support and sometimes invest in the slave economy. Again, Tom Devine notes the large number of physicians trained in Scotland who sought work in the Caribbean. These included those who used their medical earnings from working on the slave ships and treating the enslaved on the plantations to buy their way into the trade itself. The Scottish universities trained as many as 10,000 medical graduates between 1750 and 1850, most of whom obtained work in the colonies. To address this issue, the Royal College of Physicians has established a working group to consider, and I quote, the role of the college as an institution of slavery, including its relationship with the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which owned plantations, the role of past presidents of the college in slavery, and the connections of fellows and members with slavery, including owning enslaved people, employment on slave plantations as doctors, and working as ship surgeons or physicians on slave ships. Our galleries and museums, of course, should be referenced here. As mentioned before, Scotland's principal collections have not been as forthcoming as some others in addressing issues associated with slavery and colonialism, but this is now starting to be addressed, as anyone who has recently visited the National Museum of Scotland will have noticed. Many individuals who profited from slavery were, of course, significant patrons of the arts. A good example is Robert Graham, whose portrait by Henry Raeburn hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. The National Gallery now states on its website that this is Robert Cunningham Graham, who attained celebrity as a poet, supporter of human rights, and benefactor of Glasgow University. Like many wealthy 18th century Scots, however, his prosperity was founded on involvement with the Caribbean slave economy. He was a planter, receiver general of taxes, and slaveholder in Jamaica. He exploited his position of power to have sexual relations with many enslaved women, and continued to buy and sell slaves even after his return to Scotland in 1770 to 71. Raeburn's boldly painted portrait gives no hint that Cunningham Graham's wealth depended on the labour of enslaved Africans. Finally, to the church and clergymen. While some churchmen were prominent abolitionists, profits from slavery and colonialism also supported our churches. Church buildings and furnishings were sometimes funded by individuals who owned plantations or who made significant profits from British colonial activities. Let's look at some of these cases. In 1843, an independent sect broke away from the established Church of Scotland to form the Free Church, led by Dr. Thomas Chalmers. And this is the famous image by David Octavius Hill of the Disruption Assembly. To raise money for their new organisation, missionaries were sent to the United States, and slaveholders proved particularly interested in the cause. Their donations of £3,000 angered abolitionists who denounced the Free Church for supporting slavery. It was left to Frederick Douglass to lead the campaign to send back the money. He commented, When the slaves of America heard of a free church, we had reason to believe that the day of our redemption drew near. But they accepted the slaveholders' invitation, took their money, paralyzed their own Christian feelings, turned a deaf ear to the groan of the slave as they went on their way through the South, were dumb on the question of slavery, were invited by the slave owners to their pulpits, dined at their tables, in their pews, heard them preach to their slave congregations, took the blood money which was offered them and brought it to Scotland to pay for free church ministers. I charged them with having gone into the land of the man-stealers, among men whom they knew to be man-stealers. They struck for the sake of money. Tell them to send back to America that blood-stained money. Countless gifts and endowments given to Edinburgh's churches from the middle of the 18th to the middle of the 19th centuries are almost certain to have been derived from the profits of slavery and colonialism. One example is from St. John's Episcopal Church, Lothian Road. Several wealthy members of the church, including Alexander Todd, Thomas Robertson and Alexander Dice, contributed a significant amount to the cost of the new church. All had made their fortunes through the East India Company. I'd like to turn briefly to the role of Edinburgh in the abolition movement. By the way, this image is the 18th century medallion produced by Josiah Wedgwood for the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which he supported from 1787 until his death in 1795. Eric Williams, the historian and former Prime Minister of Trinidad, famously argued that the slave trade was abolished when it became uneconomic. The hagiography surrounding 18th and 19th century abolitionists was unjustified. In today's language, perhaps an early example of white saviour complex. Today, many scholars accept that the viability of the West Indian plantations was declining, but that individuals, religious and civic institutions also played a role in achieving eventual abolition. Ian White, in his book on Scotland and abolition, has argued that no one group, factor or individual can claim sole responsibility for the abolition of British imperial slavery. And yet, as cities go, Edinburgh's role was notable. Our starting point needs to be the famous case of Knight versus Wedderburn at the Court of Session in 1778. Joseph Knight's legal challenge began in 1774 in the Justices of the Peace Court in Perth, where he sought the freedom to leave the employment of John Weddeburn. Knight claimed that, although many years earlier he had been purchased by Wedderburn in Jamaica from a slave trader, the act of landing in Scotland freed him from perpetual servitude, as slavery was not recognised in Scotland. The Justices of the Peace found in favour of Wedderburn. However, Knight appealed to the Sheriff of Perth, who found that the state of slavery is not recognised by the laws of this kingdom, and is inconsistent with the principles thereof. Wedderburn then appealed to the Court of Session. His main argument was that slavery and perpetual servitude were different states, and that in Scots law, Knight, even though he was not recognised as an enslaved person, was still bound to provide perpetual service in the same manner as an indentured servant or an apprenticed artisan. Notwithstanding Wedderburn's evidence, the Court of Session ruled that the dominion assumed over this Negro under the law of Jamaica, being unjust, could not be supported in this country to any extent. Interestingly, Knight was represented by Henry Dundas, succeeded in arguing that he should be allowed to leave domestic service and provide a home for his wife and child. In doing so, he gave the Court of Session the opportunity to declare that slavery was not recognised by Scots law, and that fugitives from slavery could be protected by the courts if they wished to leave domestic service. While an important case in Scotland, the ruling of course made no legal difference to the condition of slaves in the West Indies. Nevertheless, some form of moral victory had been achieved here in Edinburgh. The late 18th and early 19th century saw many waves of abolitionist fervour sweep the country, most often associated with the Clapham sect and William Wilberforce. In Edinburgh, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Mitchell Thompson, minister of Greyfriars and St George's, is a representative of a significant number of clergy from across the spectrum who campaigned for abolition, travelling the country to give speeches and organising petitions which would be sent to Parliament throughout the 1820s. It should be noted, though, that the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland never petitioned against either slavery or the slave trade. On the 8th of October 1830, at the Assembly Rooms, Dr. Thompson gave a speech, the reaction to which was described as the bursting of a bomb. He argued that abolition should not occur at the earliest possible opportunity. But he believed, which he believed would result in endless delay and excuses, but immediately. Thompson, according to an eyewitness account by Henry Coburn, declared that if abolition meant the shedding of blood, it was a necessary price for ending the slavery of 800,000 human beings. After the furore had died down, a second meeting on the 19th of October agreed to petition the British legislature for the immediate and total abolition of slavery. 3 long years later, this was passed into law in the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. The ladies of Edinburgh also deserve mention for the role they played in changing public attitudes to slavery, especially the Edinburgh Ladies' Emancipation Society, which met regularly at the Colton convening rooms on Waterloo Place. Suffragist Eliza Wigham was their treasurer. In addition to the legacy of slavery, Edinburgh, as well as many other UK cities and cultural institutions, ranging from the National Museum of Scotland to the British Museum, are also keen to explore the legacy of colonialism. This clearly extends the subject significantly. The history of British colonialism and the involvement of Scots, many from Edinburgh, is a vast subject, far beyond the scope of today's talk. But, as with slavery, it will become clear over the coming years that Scots and the city of Edinburgh benefited disproportionately from the profits of colonialism compared to other British cities. A brief look at the Scottish dominance of the East India Company is a case in point. Long before our own Henry Dundas was appointed President of the Board of Control in 1793, a government position with responsibility for the oversight of the East India Company before it was nationalised, Scots had seized the opportunity to profit from colonial activities in South Asia. From the 1720s, a remarkable number of Scots began to appear abroad as servants of the EIC, at first mainly as civil servants, medical men, and as crew of East Indiamen, while others became free merchants in the settlements. After Culloden, Scottish military officers were also recruited in vast numbers into the EIC's military branch. George K. McGilvary suggests that the Scots were present in exceptional numbers because the Whig government in London began to use East India patronage to maintain political control of Scotland. As a result, a disproportionate number of Scots came to fill positions in the East India Company, in its shipping and as free merchants. Such was the need in Scotland for employment among the friends and younger sons of lairds, gentry, lawyers, clerics, military and naval officers that the opportunity was greeted enthusiastically. Scottish grandees gladly exchanged electoral votes and agreed to support Whig candidates for Westminster in return for such bounty. By the late 18th century, houses of agency in all settlements were overwhelmingly in the hands of Scottish free merchants. The names Jardine and Matheson, still with a major corporate presence in Asia, are a reminder of these connections today. For anyone interested, I'd strongly recommend William Dalrymple's History of the East India Company, The Anarchy, which very effectively explodes the myth that the EIC takeover of India was anything other than an exercise in opportunism, violence, and greed. So, to start to sum up, these histories of slavery and abolition and of colonialism are deeply interwoven into the material fabric of Edinburgh, often hiding in plain sight. A significant number of our buildings, streets, institutions, collections, monuments, and public spaces were created or remodeled as expressions of taste and refinement, as well as power and privilege, but are to some extent tainted through their association with an economic system grounded in human misery. Several years ago, Edinburgh World Heritage engaged with a group of young people in order to understand what we needed to do to build a stronger sense of connection between them and our heritage. The result of this work was the creation of a young person's heritage manifesto. The first clause of this manifesto was that we need to have honest conversations about heritage and values. The heritage industry is seen as being out of step with young people's values. While young people see the importance of the conservation of objects, we need to accept that the values they represent can be outdated and lacking in relevance. We therefore need to be honest and recognize this, encouraging young people to get involved and have a healthy debate about the issues thrown up by the past, issues such as slavery, LGBT rights, and child poverty, among others. We cannot dismiss these as the concerns of the woke generation. Young people will soon be the custodians of our heritage, and our hope for the future is that the significance of Edinburgh's unique heritage is appreciated and cared for by a far wider group of people than has been the case in the past. This is certainly the expectation of UNESCO and the Scottish Government. Concerning slavery and colonial exploitation in general, we believe that only by honestly and openly acknowledging and sharing these facts and stories can we do justice to the true complexity of past, present and future, and the sometimes uncomfortable role that Britain, including Scotland, have played in global history since the 16th century or even earlier. To some extent, this has been a reaction to the deep sense of shock and injustice which engulfed the world following the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. But it needed to happen. As we've heard, until very recently, there has been a remarkable unwillingness to acknowledge and come to terms with Scotland's and Edinburgh's disproportionate involvement in slavery and colonialism. As a society and as a city, we expect and sincerely hope that newly arrived families or the descendants of slaves or colonial subjects become integrated, to become fully engaged in our common project of building a better future for our children and grandchildren. But I fear this will not happen unless we're honest about the past. Should we dismantle monuments and rename buildings and public spaces? No. These are historical artifacts which must be preserved, but with appropriate interpretation and comprehensive programs of education, both for children and adults. Scottish and British colonial history must be taught in schools, both at primary and secondary levels. New technology can also be harnessed to ensure that our historic environment can be enjoyed and appreciated with appropriate context and explanation. Most importantly, as a city, we need to have an informed and thoughtful conversation about these issues, respectful of different points of view, based on facts and not misinformation or prejudice. We also need to avoid becoming fixated with debating the rights and wrongs of the actions of one individual, which can result in us failing to see the bigger picture, that the legacies of slavery and colonialism can be seen everywhere in Edinburgh, and that however much we may want to avoid the subject, they represent a stain on the history of our city. And in this context, I'd like to acknowledge the pioneering work of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association in raising awareness of many of these issues, specifically the work of Lisa Williams, the association's founder. No one alive today is responsible for the iniquities of the period in question, and consequently we should feel confident in acknowledging the positive and negative factual evidence of the past as part of our shared histories. These histories are sometimes difficult to read and to consider. They make us question our assumptions about the past, and yet they can also deepen and enrich our understanding of our economic status, our remarkable built heritage, and the art, objects, places, and spaces we enjoy today and look after for future generations. In conclusion, I would say we all need to be stopped in our tracks by these reminders, these Stolpersteine, before continuing on our path towards a more enlightened future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that excellent talk. And I can see from the comments that people have been really enjoying it. Now, we have some time to answer just a couple of questions. The Q&A has been wonderfully busy. So of course we will not get to them all, but we will do our best to select a good sample. Okay, so Nick, the first question that we have for you comes from Stuart. An interesting one. He asks, well, he states, avoiding self-mythologizing seems like a tall order, especially for Britain. Do you think it can be done today, and how?
I think so. It's difficult with the misinformation that that abounds in contemporary society, but we need to have respect for the academic study of history and for the individuals in Scotland and around the world who attempt to uncover the truth and to identify the facts about the past. And they are experts that are sometimes maligned and thought to be arguing from a particular rhetorical point of view. But most academic historians, and the ones I've worked with over the last couple of years, are committed to uncovering the truth and making that available to everyone. So that's an important step. And the next piece is for that to then flow down through our education systems and to ensure that, as with the climate response, where we're seeing very high levels of engagement and interest and awareness, based on good science in our schools, that the same is true of our colonial and slavery past, that the subject is taught well, that issues such as the one around Glasgow's role in the slave trade are addressed, and Edinburgh's. And I know the city's committed to do that. So I think it has to start with education, really, and an acknowledgement that there are experts in this field. I mentioned Lisa Williams, there are many others. So I think we all have a responsibility as citizens to make sure that we're well informed, to read up on these topics, and to make sure that with our children, with our grandchildren, we're not following a narrative about the past which is nationalistic or which avoids these difficult issues.
Absolutely. And I suppose just to add to that, it's an opportunity not just to tell more representative stories about our past, but also more positive stories about the contributions of diverse communities to Scotland. So thank you, Nick, and thank you to Stuart for that question. Right, next one, this one from Tom, and quite a detailed one. Can the speaker please explain, with an example, how work across the ocean translates into spending power for some people in Scotland? Where was the money for slave-produced goods coming from?
I think there are two broad areas. One is in the ownership of plantations, which we touched on, and as the data from the University of London shows, there were around 100 plantation owners in Edinburgh. So that's the first source of capital flowing into the city from the profits of those plantations. And that, as we saw with specific individuals, that was a significant income in today's spending power, several £million a year, that many individuals enjoyed from the profits of those plantations, as with any other agricultural production business. So that's one broad area. The other broad area is in the processing and manufacture and marketing of the products which are produced by the slave economy. And I mentioned those in terms of the main ones being sugar and tobacco, rum, rice, cotton. And so those products and those commodities became, during the 18th century, the latter half of the 18th century, dominant in Scotland's economy. And the merchants, obviously, that were responsible for the purchase and processing and export of those products made enormous profits. Some of whom then moved to Edinburgh. We looked at the example of Buchanan, many of whom stayed in Glasgow, and obviously any walk around the merchant city of Glasgow and its grandeur raises the question of where that money came from. So those are the two main areas: direct ownership of plantations and slaves, and then the trade of those goods. The third area, I guess, to give a complete answer, would be the service economy. All of the individuals, whether they were doctors or bankers or insurance brokers or lawyers, who are providing the services to support the slave economy. And that's a sort of indirect way of profiting from that. But obviously many individuals in Edinburgh were involved in that financing and legal service provision for the economy. So I guess those are the three broad areas where money was directly flowing through those channels into the city, hence the city's glorious expansion architecturally in these boom years from the 1750s onwards.
Thank you, Nick. A question now from Liz, linked to your point on institutional relationship with slavery. She specifically asks, what about Edinburgh University? Did it benefit from slave money?
Well, I talked about the medical school. That's obviously a part of the university, and I think it's the most direct example of a department within the university which produced individuals with the expertise to support the trade. But other aspects of the university's training would have obviously supported the trade in terms of legal training and so on. I would say, though, that the University of Edinburgh is conducting its own exploration of this whole area. Obviously, Glasgow was the first, I think 2 years ago now, publishing the degree to which endowments given to the University of Glasgow, the degree to which and the percentage of those which came from the profits of slavery. Edinburgh is undergoing a similar task. So I'm assuming that we will find that in the case of Edinburgh, it will also have over the years benefited from endowments and gifts which were derived from the profits of slavery, although I don't think that's been published yet. So Glasgow's a little bit further along in that area.
Thank you. And we have time for, let's say, 2 more questions. So Rosamund asks, and perhaps you and I can both answer this, has Edinburgh World Heritage been in dialogue with Edinburgh Council and its recent public engagement through a review of the impact of slavery and the slave trade that closed yesterday? I'll just start off by saying, Rosamund, the short answer is yes. We have provided our formal advice on that subject, and we will be following up with a piece on our website to detail that quite shortly. There is a wider context. I'm conscious that Nick has been very involved in a lot of engagement work over the years. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Nick?
I would just say the point I made in the talk was really that what we tried to do as we worked with the council was to look at the question from a thematic point of view and to be relatively selective, because our point was really that the slave economy and colonialism were completely intertwined and integrated into many aspects of the city's economy, politics, and culture. And that's the point that we want to get over to people, is that it was a part of an enormous machine which touched many, many aspects of life. And I think it's important for us to recognize that rather than looking at certain individuals and certain streets, where the tendency would be to say, well, it was contained to that person or to that individual or to that activity. It was a very broad set of activities which really touched all aspects of city life. So that's why it's a complex subject. But that was really the way we worked with Jeff and the team, was to direct them in that way as far as possible.
Thank you. Last question. So it seems that there is a growing consensus that decisions, education, interpretation should be evidence-based and informed by views of a diverse range of stakeholders, as you've touched on. With that in mind, are there any particular research areas that you think merit prioritizing?
I've touched on a sort of broad thesis tonight that a very high percentage of the city's activities over the golden age were really reliant on the slave economy. But that needs to be the subject of further academic research. We're sure that was right, but we don't know the exact percentage or the degree to which capital from slavery contributed to the city's expansion and success, or the degree to which those profits were then invested in the Industrial Revolution, such as in the railways and other industries. So if we are to be absolutely accurate and clear, that's the area which needs further academic study and will need funding. And we'll need people to be doing PhDs and to do postdoctoral research on the very specific connections between the capital from slavery and the profits and revenue from slavery and the degree to which that funded the city's expansion. So I think we will then definitively know the degree to which the golden age was funded from slavery.
Very well put. Right, that is the end of the questions. Nick, thank you so much. That was really enlightening. And I would say an excellent professional contribution to the importantly diverse voices on this important subject. We hope you all at home enjoy this event, and great to see some wonderful feedback in the comments. And with that, I will start to draw this event to a close. Just a small reminder for those of you who may not have had the chance or missed the boat earlier, if you do wish to donate, you can text Edinburgh WH and the amount, as you can see on the screen there, to 70450. And of course, if you would like to become a member, we'd love to have you. Please do check out our website. Keep an eye out, of course, for our next event, which we are just confirming at present, and we'll give you more details soon. We look forward to, quote unquote, seeing you, or as many of you as possible, again for our next event. And with that, I will draw this to a close. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening. Good night.